A chance encounter. David Reynolds was the kind of man who took comfort in routine. Every morning, he followed the same schedule, waking at dawn, making a strong cup of coffee, and catching the 7:30 a.m. train to his office at Foreign Enterprises. He'd worked there for over a decade, climbing the corporate ladder step by step. By now, he had earned a stable position as a senior marketing strategist, yet lately, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It was a crisp fall evening when David's world began to shift. As he left the office after a long day, the streets of the city were busy with the rhythm of rush hour, honking cars, hurried footsteps, and the distant murmur of conversations. His mind was preoccupied with the upcoming company gala, an annual event that every employee looked forward to, but one that filled him with anxiety. Every employee was required to bring a +1, and David, a bachelor by choice, usually dreaded this stipulation. As he walked through a quieter street, his eyes landed on a woman sitting on the sidewalk, her back leaning against the cold bricks of a storefront. The sight of her was not uncommon in a big city like this. Homelessness was a reality many faced, but something about this woman made David pause. She was black, with short, tightly curled hair, and wore a faded brown jacket that was far too thin for the chilly evening. Her clothes were mismatched, layers of tattered shirts and pants that looked like they'd been through more than their fair share of hardships. Next to her was a worn cardboard sign that read, "Fell on hard times. Any help is appreciated." But it wasn't her attire that caught his attention. It was her eyes, sharp, intelligent, and steady, despite the obvious struggle of her situation. David slowed down, unsure why he was even thinking about approaching her. His first instinct was to keep walking, to follow his routine, but a pull of empathy drew him closer. Before he knew it, he was standing in front of her, the bustle of the city fading into the background. "Excuse me," David began awkwardly, adjusting his briefcase strap, as if it could somehow ground him. Are you okay?" The woman looked up, her eyes meeting his with a directness that unsettled him. There was no shame in her gaze, just a quiet resilience. "As well as one can be, given the circumstances," she replied evenly. Her voice was rich, controlled, and entirely unexpected. David had braced himself for a simple nod or dismissive wave, but her response made him realize this conversation might be more complicated than he thought. "I'm David," he said, trying to maintain his composure, extending his hand before realizing how awkward the gesture might seem. To his surprise, she took it. "Lisa," she responded, her grip firm but gentle. "Lisa," he repeated, as if grounding himself with the name. He searched for the right words, unsure how to continue. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but how did you end up here?" For a moment, Lisa's expression tightened. It was clear this was a question she had been asked before, maybe too many times. But after a brief pause, she answered with a calm that betrayed no anger, only exhaustion. "Life has a way of throwing curveballs, doesn't it?" she said, giving a small, rueful smile. "I had a family once, a career, dreams, but then, well, one tragedy led to another, and here I am." David felt a tightness in his chest, a mixture of sadness and respect for the dignity with which she carried herself. He'd heard similar stories before, but Lisa's poise and clarity made this one stand out. It was as though, despite everything, she had held on to a part of herself that could not be broken. "What kind of tragedy?" he asked gently, hoping he wasn't prying too much. Lisa's eyes darkened slightly, and she gave a slight shrug, clearly choosing her words carefully. "The kind that tears families apart. I'd rather not go into details. Suffice it to say, getting back on your feet isn't as easy as people think." David nodded, feeling the lump in his throat grow. He wasn't usually one for deep emotional conversations, especially with strangers, but something about Lisa's quiet strength stirred him. "I'm really sorry," he said, though the words felt inadequate. "Is there anything I can do to help?" For the first time, Lisa's expression softened, her eyes flickering with an emotion David couldn't quite identify. Was it gratitude, or perhaps disbelief? "You're kind to ask," she replied, her voice steady. "But I'm not looking for handouts, just a chance to rebuild." David found himself nodding again, though he had no idea how he could possibly help her rebuild a life that seemed so far from the one she had lost. But then, an idea started forming in his mind. It wasn't fully developed yet, but before he could overthink it, the words were out of his mouth. "Actually, there might be something." Lisa raised an eyebrow, the curiosity evident in her expression, but she said nothing. "I work at Thorn Industries," David explained, unsure if he was being foolish by even suggesting this. "We're having this big office party next week, and employees are supposed to bring a +1. He trailed off, suddenly feeling embarrassed. What was he thinking? He didn't even know this woman, but Lisa's amusement seemed to ease his anxiety. "And you don't have a date," she finished for him, a playful smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. David felt his face grow warm. "Well, no," he admitted, "but I was thinking maybe you'd like to come. I mean, at the very least, it's a free meal, and who knows, there might be some networking opportunities." As soon as the words left his mouth, David regretted it. He didn't want to make it seem like he was doing her a favor out of pity. He was ready to backtrack and apologize, but to his surprise, Lisa didn't look offended. Instead, she seemed to be considering it. "You're inviting a homeless woman you just met to be your date at a corporate party?" she asked, her tone a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Put that way, it did sound ridiculous, David realized. He ran a hand through his hair, flustered. "I know it sounds crazy," he said quickly, "but you seem, I don't know, different. Like you'd fit right in, and maybe it could be a chance for something good to happen." Lisa was silent for a long time, her eyes searching his face as if trying to figure him out. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but serious. "If I do this," she said slowly, "I want the chance to repay your kindness someday. I don't know how or when, but I need you to understand that I'm not taking this lightly." David felt a surge of relief and respect. Lisa had a sense of pride, a need for balance, and that made him respect her all the more. "Of course," he said, extending his hand again. "It's a deal." As they shook hands, David couldn't shake the feeling that he had just set something in motion, something far bigger than he could have anticipated. Little did he know, this was only the beginning, a new beginning. The days after David's unexpected proposal to Lisa were marked by an odd mix of anticipation and uncertainty. He couldn't stop thinking about what he had just committed to, inviting a homeless woman, a complete stranger, to his company's most prestigious event of the year. And yet there was something about Lisa that made him feel confident it was the right decision. David spent the next few days preparing for the event, alternating between excitement and nerves. His colleagues at Thorn Industries were all high-powered, ambitious professionals who thrived on status and appearances. He could already imagine the raised eyebrows and murmurs of confusion when he showed up with Lisa, someone who had so clearly fallen on hard times. But every time he considered backing out, he remembered the strength and quiet dignity in her eyes and knew he couldn't turn away. Lisa, on the other hand, remained somewhat of an enigma to him. After their first encounter, they agreed to meet up the following day to begin preparing for the event. When David offered to buy her an outfit suitable for the occasion, she hesitated, but finally agreed, saying it would be practical since she had nothing that would pass for corporate chic. On the appointed day, David met Lisa at a local coffee shop. She was sitting at a small table near the window, sipping a cup of tea as she waited for him. She looked much the same as she had when he first saw her, but there was something different in her posture, an air of anticipation, perhaps. "Hi," David greeted her, trying to sound casual as he sat down across from her. "Hi, David," Lisa replied, giving him a small but genuine smile. "I'm still not entirely sure about this, but I'm ready to give it a try." David nodded, feeling both relieved and excited. "I appreciate that. I know it's a bit unconventional." but I think it'll work out." Lisa raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharp but not unkind. "Unconventional is an understatement," she said with a wry smile. "But I trust you have good intentions, so where do we begin?" David wasn't entirely sure, but he had mapped out a rough plan. "I thought we could start with finding you something to wear for the event. It doesn't have to be too fancy, but something that'll make you feel comfortable and confident." Lisa nodded, but her eyes flickered with uncertainty. "That sounds good, but David, I don't want this to feel like charity. I've had my share of handouts, and they always come with strings attached." David met her gaze, understanding the weight of her words. "I promise, this isn't charity. Think of it as a partnership. You're helping me out, and I'm helping you. No strings, no expectations." She studied him for a moment, then relaxed slightly. "All right, let's go find this outfit." David led her to a small boutique called Second Chances, a store he'd chosen deliberately because of its name. He thought it might serve as a good omen for the fresh start. He hoped this experience could offer both of them. The shop was located in a quieter part of town, away from the high-end fashion districts, and specialized in affordable but stylish clothes. It had a welcoming atmosphere, warm lighting, racks of clothing that weren't too overwhelming, and a shopkeeper who greeted them with a bright smile. "Welcome to Second Chances. Can I help you with something today?" the woman behind the counter asked, her eyes flickering curiously over Lisa's worn appearance, but without a trace of judgment. "We're looking for an outfit," David explained. "Something elegant but not too formal. There's a company event coming up." The shopkeeper, a middle-aged woman with graying hair pulled into a bun, nodded thoughtfully. "I think I know just the thing. Please, follow me." She led them to a section of the store filled with modest but beautifully tailored dresses. Lisa hesitated at first, her fingers hovering over the fabrics as though she was out of practice with the simple act of shopping for herself. David could see the conflict in her eyes. This was a far cry from the life she had been living recently, and it was clear that the process felt both unfamiliar and slightly uncomfortable. "Go ahead," David encouraged her. "Pick something that feels right." Lisa gave him a small smile and turned her attention back to the dresses. After a few minutes of browsing, she pulled out a simple yet elegant navy blue dress. It was knee-length with a subtle A-line cut, not too flashy but clearly well-made. "What do you think?" she asked, holding it up against her body. David nodded approvingly. "I think that's perfect. Why don't you try it on?" Lisa disappeared into the fitting room, leaving David to wait outside, shifting on his feet with nervous anticipation. He couldn't help but feel like the entire situation was surreal. Here he was, buying a dress for a woman he had met just days ago on the street, about to introduce her to his colleagues as his guest at one of the company's most exclusive events. After a few minutes, the fitting room door opened, and Lisa stepped out. David's breath caught in his throat. The dress fit her perfectly, accentuating her figure in a way that was both flattering and tasteful. But it wasn't just the dress. It was the way Lisa carried herself in it. She stood a little taller, her posture more confident, her expression more relaxed. "What do you think?" she asked, a hint of vulnerability in her voice. David smiled. "You look amazing. Truly." Lisa looked down at herself, as if she could hardly believe the transformation. "It's been a while since I felt this put together." David nodded. "It suits you." The shopkeeper, who had been observing from the side, stepped forward with a knowing smile. "That dress was made for you," she said warmly. "Now let's find you some shoes to match." After trying on a few pairs of shoes, they settled on a pair of simple black heels. They also picked out a modest clutch to complete the outfit. David paid for everything without hesitation, though Lisa gave him a look that said she still wasn't entirely comfortable with the arrangement. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly as they left the store, her new clothes carefully bagged up. "Absolutely," David replied. "This is just the beginning." Over the next few days, David made sure that Lisa had a warm place to stay and food to eat, keeping the interactions casual but thoughtful. He didn't want her to feel like she was a burden, and he could sense her hesitation in fully accepting his help. But slowly, as they spent more time together, the walls between them began to lower. One afternoon, as they were having lunch at a small cafe, Lisa finally opened up a little more about her past. "I wasn't always like this," she began, her voice soft but clear. "I had a good life, once. A family. A career. I was a lawyer, believe it or not." David nearly dropped his fork in surprise. "A lawyer? Really?" Lisa nodded, her eyes distant as she recalled the life she once had. "Yeah. I was doing pretty well for myself. My husband and I, well, we were building a future together. But then, everything came crashing down." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "He died suddenly. Car accident. It was devastating. I couldn't cope. I lost everything. My job, our home, my sense of direction. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, I was on the streets." David listened in stunned silence, realizing just how much Lisa had lost. The woman sitting across from him wasn't just a stranger on the street. She was someone who had once had everything, and had been forced to start over from nothing. It was a sobering reminder of how quickly life could change. "I'm so sorry," David said quietly, unsure of what else to say. Lisa gave a small, sad smile. "Thank you. But I'm trying to move forward. That's why I agreed to go to this party with you. Maybe it's the start of something new." David nodded, feeling the strange sense of responsibility for her. "I hope so." As the day of the party approached, David could sense the excitement building in both of them. It wasn't just about the event itself. It was about the possibility of change, of new beginnings, and of the unlikely friendship that had formed between them. David had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was part of something bigger than his routine. This encounter with Lisa had opened his eyes to the complexities of life, and he knew that, no matter what happened at the party, he would never see the world in the same way again. As they left the cafe that afternoon, Lisa turned to him and said, "David, I've been thinking. Whatever happens at that party, I want you to know that I'm grateful. You didn't have to help me, but you did. And that means more to me than you could ever know." David smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. "I'm glad I did, Lisa. I'm glad I met you." Little did they know, the upcoming party would change their lives in ways neither of them could have imagined. The party of unseen expectations. The day of the office party arrived, and both David and Lisa found themselves grappling with a mix of excitement and trepidation. For David, it was the culmination of a decision that had seemed impulsive at first, but had grown into something much deeper. He could feel the weight of the upcoming event in his chest, an invisible burden of anticipation that made his heart race every time he thought about what could happen. Lisa, on the other hand, was entering uncharted territory. She had spent years surviving in the shadows, and now she was about to walk into a room filled with the city's elite, people who would be unable to see the complexities of her story with just one glance. David had planned to meet Lisa at her temporary accommodation, a modest but clean hotel room he had arranged for her. As he approached the door, a nervous energy surged through him. He knocked lightly, and after a moment, the door opened to reveal Lisa standing before him, fully dressed and ready for the evening. She looked stunning. The navy blue dress fit her perfectly, as it had when she first tried it on, but tonight it seemed to take on new life. Her hair, styled into a sleek, elegant updo, framed her face in a way that accentuated her sharp features and strong jawline. The simple heels and clutch they had picked out at the boutique completed the look, but it was her expression that truly captivated David, one of quiet confidence mixed with a hint of vulnerability. David blinked, momentarily speechless. You look incredible, Lisa." She smiled softly, a trace of shyness in her eyes. "Thank you, David. And you clean up pretty well yourself." She gestured to his own attire, an impeccably tailored black suit that made him look every bit the successful corporate man he was. David chuckled, feeling a little less nervous now. "Shall we?" Lisa hesitated for a brief moment, as though mentally preparing herself for what was to come. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "Let's do this." They made their way to the venue, a high-end event space in the heart of the city. The towering building was a symbol of Thorne Industries' power and influence, its glass walls reflecting the lights of the city skyline. Inside, the party was already in full swing. A live jazz band played softly in the background, and waiters in crisp white shirts moved gracefully through the crowd, offering champagne and hors d'oeuvres to the guests. David felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach as they stepped into the grand foyer. He knew many of his colleagues would be watching him closely tonight, not just because of the importance of the event, but because of who he had chosen to bring as his guest. In the world of corporate politics, appearances were everything, and David had just broken an unspoken rule by bringing someone outside the typical social circle. But as they moved further into the room, David felt an odd sense of calm wash over him. Whatever happened tonight, he had no regrets. He glanced at Lisa, who walked beside him with her head held high, and felt a surge of pride. She looked every bit as composed and poised as the other women in the room, if not more so. It didn't take long for the stares to begin. David noticed them almost immediately, the subtle glances, the raised eyebrows, the whispered conversations that died out the moment they passed by. He had expected this, of course, but seeing it in action was still unnerving. He knew his colleagues well, and he could read their reactions like an open book. They were curious, confused, and perhaps a little judgmental. Lisa, for her part, seemed unfazed. If she noticed the attention they were attracting, she didn't let it show. Her posture remained confident, and she met every gaze with the same calm composure she had displayed since the moment David met her. It was as though she had been preparing for this her whole life. "Oh no," David muttered under his breath, already moving toward the scene. He couldn't let this ruin the evening. But before David could reach Arthur, Lisa stepped forward, her calm and steady presence cutting through the chaos. To David's astonishment, she approached Arthur and spoke to him in a low, soothing voice, gently guiding him away from the crowd. The unveiling of shadows. The tension in the room was palpable as Lisa gently guided Arthur away from the crowd, her composed demeanor commanding the attention of everyone present. The live jazz band, sensing the disturbance, slowed their tempo, the once vibrant chatter of the room now replaced by murmurs and whispers. It was as if the entire party had been momentarily suspended, everyone unsure of what would happen next. David stood frozen, his mind struggling to reconcile the different layers of the woman he had brought to the party. A few moments ago, Lisa had revealed fragments of a life that was far more complex than he had ever imagined. And now, here she was, de-escalating a situation with an ease that spoke of experience, confidence, and an understanding of human behavior that went far beyond simple empathy. Arthur, who moments before had been stumbling and shouting incoherently, was now leaning on Lisa's arm as she led him toward a quieter corner of the room. His head hung low, his steps unsteady, but the wildness in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by a tired resignation. "I'm so sorry," Arthur mumbled, his voice thick with intoxication. "I didn't mean to. It's all right," Lisa said softly, her voice calm and reassuring. "Let's get you some water, okay? You're going to be fine." David hurried after them, his heart racing. The scene that had just unfolded left him filled with questions about Arthur's outburst, about Lisa's incredible ability to step in and take control, and about the deeper connection she might have had with his world, with Thorne Industries. He couldn't shake the image of the quiet recognition in Thomas Thorne's eyes when he had met Lisa earlier in the evening. By the time David reached them, Lisa had already seated Arthur in a plush chair near the back of the room. She knelt beside him, speaking in low tones that David couldn't quite make out. Arthur nodded mutely, his face flushed and sweaty, but the panic that had gripped him earlier seemed to have dissipated under Lisa's gentle guidance. A waiter appeared, carrying a glass of water, which Lisa took gratefully. She handed it to Arthur, who sipped it slowly, his trembling hands barely managing to hold the glass steady. After a few moments, Arthur leaned back in the chair, his eyes closing as if the weight of the evening had finally caught up with him. David knelt beside Lisa, whispering, "How did you know what to do?" Lisa glanced at him, her expression thoughtful but composed. "I've seen it before," she said quietly. "People under pressure, especially in environments like this, sometimes all they need is someone to remind them they're still in control." David blinked, absorbing her words. "You make it sound like you've dealt with this kind of thing often." Lisa sighed softly, her gaze drifting over Arthur's slumped figure. "In a way, I have. My husband—" She paused, her lips pressing into a thin line. "He worked in high-stakes finance. Parties like this, corporate events, they were part of our life for a long time. I saw a lot of people lose themselves under the weight of it all. The pressure, the competition, the need to always be more." David watched her closely, sensing the pain beneath her words. There was so much she hadn't told him yet, so much hidden beneath the surface of her poised exterior. But now wasn't the time to press for answers. Instead, he said, "You really helped him. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Lisa gave a small nod, but there was no triumph in her expression, only a quiet understanding. He just needed someone to see him, really see him, that's all. As the initial shock of Arthur's outburst began to fade, the other guests slowly resumed their conversations, though David could still feel the occasional glance in their direction. The band picked up the tempo once again, and the soft clink of champagne glasses filled the air. Yet the atmosphere remained different, charged with the knowledge that something unexpected had happened, and that something else still lay just beneath the surface. David looked around, hoping to catch a glimpse of Thomas Thorne. He wanted to know what the CEO had made of the situation, especially after his strange reaction to Lisa earlier. But Thorne was nowhere to be seen, having likely retreated to one of the more private rooms reserved for high-level executives. That, too, was unusual for a man who was typically the center of attention at these events. David's thoughts were interrupted when Arthur groaned softly, his eyes fluttering open again. "I need to go home," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Lisa nodded. "Do you have someone who can take you?" Arthur fumbled for his phone, but his hands were still unsteady. David stepped forward, gently taking the phone from him and scrolling through his contacts. "I'll call you a cab," he said. "You'll be home soon." While they waited for the cab to arrive, David and Lisa sat beside Arthur, keeping an eye on him as the party carried on in the background. Lisa's calm presence had transformed the energy of the evening, and David couldn't help but marvel at how naturally she had handled everything. As they sat in silence, David felt the weight of the unanswered questions pressing down on him. He knew that Lisa had secrets, ones that went beyond the simple story of falling on hard times. And tonight, those secrets had begun to surface, one by one, like fragments of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together yet. Finally, when the cab arrived and Arthur had been safely escorted outside, David turned to Lisa, his voice low and tentative. "There's more to your story, isn't there?" Lisa glanced at him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she didn't say anything, as though weighing her options, deciding how much to reveal. Then, with a soft sigh, she nodded. "Yes," she said quietly. "There's more. Much more." David's heart thudded in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. "You don't have to tell me if you're not ready." Lisa looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the delicate folds of her dress. "It's not that I don't want to tell you," she said slowly. "It's just complicated, and I wasn't sure if tonight was the right time to bring it all up. But after what happened with Arthur, and with Thomas Thorne recognizing me." David leaned forward, his gaze locked on hers. "I want to understand, Lisa. Whatever it is, I'm here." She met his eyes, and for the first time since they had arrived at the party, David saw a flicker of vulnerability behind her calm exterior. It was as though a wall she had carefully constructed was beginning to crumble, piece by piece. "I told you my husband was an investment banker," she began, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "What I didn't tell you is that he was one of the top bankers in the city. We had everything. A beautiful house, vacations, cars. It was the kind of life most people dream of. But underneath it all, there were cracks. My husband was under constant pressure to perform, to meet impossible expectations, and eventually it all became too much." David listened intently, his mind racing to fill in the gaps of her story. "He made some bad decisions," Lisa continued, her voice tightening. "Risky investments, deals that were supposed to be sure things but fell apart at the last minute. And then, one day, it all came crashing down. His firm was investigated for fraud, and we lost everything. The house, the cars, the savings, gone." David's heart ached as he heard the pain in her voice, but he remained silent, letting her continue. "We tried to start over, but it was too late. The scandal had destroyed his reputation, and no one would hire him. We were drowning in debt, and my husband, he couldn't handle it. One night, he just disappeared." David's breath caught in his throat. "Disappeared? What do you mean?" Lisa's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "He left a note saying he couldn't go on, that he had failed us. I never saw him again." For a moment, David didn't know what to say. He had thought he understood hardship, but this was a level of loss and betrayal he couldn't even begin to fathom. "I had nothing left," Lisa continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "No money, no job, no home. I ended up on the streets, just trying to survive." David reached out, gently taking her hand. "I'm so sorry, Lisa. I had no idea." Lisa gave a small, bittersweet smile. "How could you have known? It's not exactly something I talk about. But when I met you, when you offered me that chance to come here tonight, I thought maybe it was time to start moving forward again. Maybe it was time to stop hiding." David squeezed her hand, his heart filled with a deep sense of admiration for her strength. "You've already come so far, Lisa. You're stronger than you think." Before Lisa could respond, a familiar voice interrupted their conversation. "Lisa." David turned to see Thomas Thorne standing a few feet away, his eyes wide with disbelief. David's heart raced. It was clear that the CEO hadn't just recognized her, he knew her. But how? Lisa stood, her hand slipping from David's. She faced Thorne, her expression unreadable. "Hello, Thomas," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tension in the echoes of the past. Thomas Thorne's voice cut through the air like a knife, heavy with unspoken recognition. The murmurs of the party seemed to quiet around them, as if the very atmosphere had shifted. The sounds of clinking glasses and jazz music faded into the background, swallowed by the weight of the moment. Lisa stood with her back straight, her expression calm but guarded, like a fortress made of steel and ice. David watched her closely, his own heart racing. He had suspected that Lisa's past held secrets, but this was a revelation that sent ripples through the very foundation of the evening. Thomas Thorne, the towering figure of Thorne Industries, seemed to recognize her. There was a brief, charged silence before Thorne spoke again. "Lisa," he repeated, his tone softer now, though still filled with a mixture of surprise and something deeper. He took a step toward her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to confirm something that he hadn't dared to say aloud. Lisa didn't flinch. She remained composed, though David could sense the subtle tension in her posture. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and in that fleeting glance, David saw a flicker of something. Fear, regret. Whatever it was buried beneath layers of control. David took a breath, stepping forward slightly to stand beside her. "You two know each other?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual, though the confusion in his tone was evident. Lisa's lips tightened, but she nodded ever so slightly. "Yes," she said, her voice low but steady. "We do." Thomas Thorne's gaze flickered from Lisa to David, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You didn't mention her when we spoke earlier, David." David felt the undercurrent of tension in the room swell with every passing second. His mind raced, processing everything. The CEO's tone had shifted, and something unspoken hung between them, something that David couldn't quite place. He glanced at Lisa, sensing that there was a history between her and Thorne that went far beyond the surface of their professional dealings. Lisa remained calm, though David could feel the strain in her. "There's no need for it to be discussed here," she said, her voice polite but firm. "It's been a long time, and the past is just that, past." Thomas Thorne, for all his wealth and power, seemed to hesitate. His eyes, sharp and calculating, flickered with recognition as they moved over her. His gaze softened for a brief moment, though the hard edge of his businesslike persona remained. "I suppose you're right," he said, the words thick with history. He looked at David again, as though weighing his next words. "Perhaps we can talk later." David felt a strange sense of unease settle in his chest. Thorne's reaction, his unexpected recognition of Lisa, and his decision to step away so quickly, left him with more questions than answers. Lisa, for her part, simply nodded, offering Thorne a tight, polite smile. "Of course." The silence between them grew, and for a moment, David wasn't sure if he should speak, if the tension between the two would somehow fracture the night further. He glanced at Lisa, seeing the tightness in her jaw, the way she seemed to close herself off emotionally, as if she were bracing for something that wasn't yet spoken. Finally, Thorne turned to leave, his broad shoulders cutting through the crowd like a figure of authority. As he moved away, Lisa exhaled softly, her posture relaxing just a fraction. The tension in the room began to lift, though David still felt the weight of unanswered questions lingering in the air. Lisa looked at him, her gaze steady but distant. "I didn't expect him to be here tonight." David studied her, his voice low and cautious. "Do you want to talk about it?" She shook her head, her expression unreadable, and for a moment there was something almost imperceptibly sad in her eyes. "Not right now," she said softly. "I don't think I'm ready for that conversation." David didn't press her further. There was something about the way she carried herself, the strength with which she guarded her past, that told him this was a story she wasn't prepared to share yet. But he could see the pain in her eyes, a trace of something deeper that refused to be shaken. He knew then that whatever history existed between her and Thorne was more complicated than he could have imagined. It wasn't just a distant professional acquaintance. It was something personal. The evening passed in a strange haze. The party had returned to its usual rhythm. But the memory of Thorne's unexpected appearance and Lisa's response hung over them like a cloud. David kept an eye on Lisa, feeling the weight of her silence as she engaged with others in the crowd, her composure unshaken but her eyes betraying a deeper sadness. He could sense that she was working hard to keep everything in check, to not let the past unravel in this public space. But David also knew she was teetering on the edge of something. As the night wore on, Lisa seemed to retreat into herself, her once steadfast confidence becoming more guarded. David couldn't blame her. The party, which had initially felt like an escape, had now become a reminder of everything she had left behind, of the past she was trying to outrun. When the party started to wind down and the crowd began to thin out, David found a quiet moment to speak to her. "Do you want to leave soon?" he asked gently. Lisa glanced around the room, her gaze drifting over the empty glasses and the scattered conversation bubbles of the guests. The once bustling atmosphere now felt almost eerie in its stillness. "Yes," she replied softly. "I think it's time." They made their way to the exit, the weight of the evening's revelations sinking in with every step. David wanted to ask more, to press her about Thorne, about the strange dynamic between them. But he sensed now wasn't the right time. She had already given him more of herself tonight than she had in all the time they'd known each other. And though the silence between them was thick with unspoken words, he chose to let it sit. Once they were outside, the cool night air hit them, a sharp contrast to the warm, crowded room they had just left behind. The city lights shimmered around them, but even in the glow of the street lamps, David could see that Lisa was lost in thought. "I'm sorry about tonight," David said after a moment. "I never expected it to get so complicated." Lisa shook her head, her voice soft but firm. "No, don't apologize, David. It wasn't your fault. It's just—" She paused, her eyes flickering with emotion. "There are things that are hard to leave behind. Things that stay with you, even when you don't want them to." David wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but he held back, sensing that it wasn't what she needed. "Do you want to talk about it now? Or would you rather not?" Lisa took a long breath, her shoulders sagging as though the weight of the night had finally caught up with her. She looked up at him, her eyes tired but resolute. "I'll tell you one day, David. I promise. But tonight, it's too soon." David nodded, accepting her words without question. He knew the burden she carried was heavy, but he also knew that trust was something that couldn't be rushed. They both had their own battles to fight, their own histories to reconcile. He just had to be patient, and if he was lucky, she would let him in when she was ready. As they stood in the quiet street, the city around them bustling with its usual nighttime energy, David offered her a soft smile. "Whenever you're ready," he said quietly. Lisa returned the smile, though it was tinged with sadness. "Thank you, David." They stood there for a moment longer, letting the silence speak between them. Then, without another word, they climbed into a cab that would take them both back to their respective lives, lives that were now more intertwined than they had been before, whether either of them was ready to admit it or not. The cab pulled away from the curve, the city lights flickering past, and for the first time that night, David allowed himself to think about the future with Lisa. He didn't know what it would hold, but for now, that uncertainty was a kind of hope. The unfolding horizon. Weeks passed since that night, and with each day, David found himself more deeply ensnared by the quiet complexity of Lisa's presence in his life. After the party, the world around him continued its ceaseless hustle, but in his mind, everything had subtly shifted. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing the unseen threads connecting his own life to hers. The tension that had lingered after Thorne's unexpected recognition remained, but it was now joined by an undercurrent of something stronger: curiosity, concern, and a growing sense of responsibility. Lisa had kept her distance, retreating into the same quiet space she had occupied when David first met her. She'd sent him a few texts, always polite and succinct, but never fully opening up. David tried not to take it personally. He understood that her past was complicated, that it was something she needed to come to terms with in her own time. But each day that passed without a deeper connection made him wonder, just how far back did the wounds run? One afternoon, David sat at his desk in Thorne Industries, the hum of the office around him more distant than usual. His computer screen glowed in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. His colleagues chatted in the background, discussing the latest project updates and casual office gossip, but David couldn't quite focus. It wasn't that he was unhappy at work. His career was stable, his contributions appreciated. But the thrill he had once felt for marketing strategies and sales projections now felt hollow compared to the depth of his thoughts about Lisa. He hadn't been able to shake the look in her eyes when she had quietly declined to speak about her past at the party. There was something raw beneath that calm exterior, something that had yet to be revealed. And David was desperate to understand it, to help her in whatever way he could. Just as he was getting lost in thought, his phone buzzed with a message. "Lisa, are you free this evening?" The message was simple, but it sent a rush of warmth through him. It had been days since she had reached out beyond the brief exchanges they'd had about the party. David glanced at the time. It was just past 5, and the office was beginning to empty out. The evening was still open to him. He quickly tapped out a response. David, I am. Anything you need. Lisa, I could use a drink. Not alcohol, but maybe some conversation. David smiled to himself. Conversation. That word was an invitation. She had rarely asked for anything, and yet here she was, acknowledging the need for connection. His heart skipped a beat. David, I'll pick you up in an hour. The familiar streets of the city, now bathed in the golden hues of the setting sun, seemed quieter than usual as David drove through the winding roads to Lisa's location. He had chosen a small cafe they had passed once, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, a place where the outside world seemed to slow down just enough for you to breathe. It was the perfect setting for a conversation long overdue. When he arrived, he saw Lisa standing outside, her arms crossed, her head tilted slightly as if listening to the hum of the evening air. She wore a simple navy dress and a black jacket, her hair loosely tied back. She looked both like the woman he had met on the street and someone entirely different, a woman with stories untold, a woman with resilience in her posture and grace in the way she moved. David stepped out of the car, walking toward her. You look good, he said with a small smile, a compliment that felt more like an acknowledgement of the transformation he had witnessed in her over the past weeks. Thanks, she replied, her smile faint but genuine. It's strange, wearing something other than what I've gotten used to. I bet. He gestured to the cafe. Shall we? Lisa nodded, and together they walked inside, the air inside cooler than the streets outside. The warm scent of fresh pastries and brewed coffee greeted them as they found a quiet table at the back. David could feel the tension in the air, but he also sensed that Lisa was more open tonight, perhaps even willing to begin untangling the knots of her past. As they sat down, the waitress brought over menus, and after a brief exchange, Lisa ordered a herbal tea. David chose an espresso. The atmosphere between them felt less strained than before, and for the first time, Lisa wasn't keeping her emotions locked away behind a mask of politeness. I've been meaning to talk to you about the other night, she said, once the waitress had left. Her voice was quieter than usual, but there was a certain steel to it that told David she was preparing to finally open up. David leaned forward slightly, his curiosity piqued. About Thorn. Lisa nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. Yes, about him, and everything that came before. David's breath caught in his throat, a sense of anticipation rising within him. He knew this was the moment when the story of her past was about to begin. But would it be a story of pain or of triumph, or something else entirely? Before Thorn became the CEO of this company, Lisa began slowly. He was someone I knew very well. Not just a professional acquaintance, but someone I trusted. David's heart skipped. You were close to him. Lisa looked up, her eyes meeting his, her gaze unwavering. We were married. The words hung between them like a storm cloud. David blinked, momentarily stunned by the revelation. The realization hit him with a rush of conflicting emotions. He had known there was something deep and complex in Lisa's past, but to hear that Thomas Thorn, the formidable figure at the helm of the company, had once been her husband, that changed everything. We were married for a while, Lisa continued, her voice a mixture of sadness and detachment. Before all this, she gestured vaguely, indicating her present situation. Before the fall. David sat back, struggling to process. But I thought you said you lost everything. I mean, when we first met. Lisa nodded, her eyes distant. Yes, everything. But you don't lose something overnight. It's a slow erosion. And that's what happened to us. When Thorn became obsessed with the company, the marriage, it became second to him. Everything that once mattered, family, love, even the basics of a shared life, was overshadowed by his ambition. David didn't know what to say. He'd heard of people driven by ambition, of relationships that fell apart in the wake of professional success, but hearing it firsthand from Lisa carried a weight that struck him deeply. It explained so much about the guarded way Lisa carried herself and why she seemed so distant from the world around her. "I tried, David," Lisa said, her voice tightening, her hands gripping her teacup. "I tried to make him see, to make him remember the things that used to matter. But the more successful he became, the more he pushed me away. Until one day, he just stopped coming home. And when he did, it was like we were strangers, living in the same house." The pain in her voice was unmistakable. David could see the cracks in her otherwise composed exterior. And then, Lisa continued, "One day, it was like the world just collapsed. There were whispers in the company. The kind of whispers you don't ignore. I found out that he had been making moves behind my back, using his position at the company to make some questionable decisions. I confronted him about it. And in the end, that was the last straw. I left." David listened, his heart heavy with the weight of Lisa's words. He could see it now, the pain that had shaped the woman sitting across from him. The loss of everything she had once held dear, the betrayal, the isolation. "I thought about fighting him for everything," Lisa added quietly. "But in the end, I couldn't. What was the point? The life I once knew was gone. The people I had trusted had betrayed me. So I walked away." David reached across the table, his hand gently resting over hers. He felt a deep surge of empathy for the woman before him, but he also felt something more. Admiration for the strength she had shown in walking away from everything, in choosing to rebuild from the ground up. "You're stronger than you know, Lisa," David said softly. "What you've been through, it's more than most people could endure, and you're still here." Lisa smiled faintly, her eyes glistening with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "I'm trying to be." There was a long pause between them as they both absorbed the weight of the conversation. For the first time, David realized just how much more there was to Lisa's story, how much more there was to uncover. But tonight, she had given him a glimpse into the depths of her pain, and it was enough to make him see her in a new light. "I don't know where this is going," David said after a while. "But I know I want to help. Whatever it takes, whatever you need, I'm here." Lisa's eyes softened, and for the first time, David saw a glimmer of hope in her expression. It wasn't just a thank you. It was something deeper, something that spoke of possibility, a future that she had perhaps once given up on, but that now seemed within reach again. "I believe you, David," Lisa whispered, "but there's still a long way to go." And with that, the conversation drifted into silence once more.